Hey folks, I'm Karthig. I'm a PM on the Teams Platform Developer Lifecycle team, and I'm joined by Alan as well.
Hello, everyone. I would turn on my video, but let me see. Let's see. I'm having video issues.
You're still stuck in the matrix.
Yeah, you are.
So I'm going to turn that off so I don't give anybody a headache. But yes,
yep. Sounds good.
Tech lead for Dev Lifecycle.
All good.
All right.
And I'm going to turn off my video as well. There are a few people on the call. I want to make sure that we use our bandwidth efficiently here. So Alan and I, in case you haven't checked out the tool before, we worked on and released the Microsoft Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio Code. And we'll be walking through an upcoming update to the toolkit. This is an update that you'll be able to download hopefully sometime this week. And what it will enable you to do is that it's going to enable you to create a tab-based Teams app that performs single sign-on authentication and then does a subsequent call to Graph to retrieve your user profile photo and displays it in our basic Hello World app that you get from creating an app with the Microsoft Teams Toolkit. So for those of you who don't know, this is the tool. You can use it to create scaffolds that serve as the foundation for your Teams app. I've already logged into this extension for Visual Studio Code, so now I'm just going to start creating an app. So I hit create a new Teams app, and this is going to be a tab. And let's call it my dev community app. And this is a personal tab, and this tab is going to require single sign-on authentication. Perfect. And if you've built an app that does SSO before, you already know that you need to go to the Azure portal and provision an app registration and configure about 6 pages. There are about 20-ish steps. We figured out that all you really need to do to get up and running with SSO and Graph is tell us the domain name where your app's going to be hosted, and we can pretty much provision the app for you and help you get up and running with just this piece of information. I've already reserved this ngrok URL. If you're not using ngrok, it's a tunneling service that gives you a domain name. Perfect. And now we are just going to go and provision our AAD app registration. As you can see, we're getting back a client ID, an app ID URI, a eDirect URI using the domain name that I just provided, and a secret. Everything's going to be flushed after this call, so you can't use any of this. I'm going to hit finish now. I'm just going to now select where this gets saved. And hopefully, ta-da, there is the project. Here we go. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is start installing the libraries because it takes a little bit of time. And there are actually 2 project folders that get created with an SSO project, the API server package. All right, oops, already done that. Okay, npm start. And there is another project that is contained in the source folder. So the API server has one project you need to install, and the source folder has another. And this contains, the source folder contains the server logic that serves your front end. And it is a React scripts app, and it's super minimal. And while that loads, I'm also going to open up a third terminal window and run ngrok. And I think I might have, oops, I meant to type grep. Nope, okay, I'm gonna have to do this, HTTP. So what I'm doing now is running ngrok and pointing ngrok to my localhost, 3000. Okay, and the subdomain will be teamflix. And as you can see, perfect, teamflix.ngrok.io is pointing to my localhost server at port 3000. This is still installing. That is installed, and the server is running at port 5000. And before we begin, I'm going to do one thing. Our launch.json script, which launches the app when you're ready, launches in Chrome by default. I'm going to change this to Edge, and I have the Edge debugger for Visual Studio Code already installed on my machine. And the reason I'm doing this is because we have IT admin policies that require us to open Teams, the web client, in Edge, not Chrome at Microsoft. So that's why I'm doing it. You may not have to do this, but it's something I have to do. And when you run this app, when you hit F5, what happens is the app gets launched in the Teams web client, and tab is already installed. The tab front-end packages have been already installed, and I just hit npm install again, which is not what I meant to do. I meant to hit npm start. So let's do this. Let's wait for this to finish. I don't want to stop it now. And what I'm going to do is start walking through the code. Okay, if you open up your source directory and then components, most of the logic that you need to pay attention to is going to be in this tab.js file. I'm going to assume that most people here are already familiar with React. I'm not going to use this as an opportunity to go over React. Oh, perfect, never mind. This is already done sooner rather than later. And once this extensions update is available for you and you decide to try it out, what I recommend is just starting with the tab.js file and just walking through the code top to bottom. We've added a lot of comments in here so that you can just walk through this one file here, and it should walk you through everything you need to know to understand how tab SSO works. And I'm going to start doing that right now for you. So the first thing you want to look at is this component did mount function. This is a React lifecycle method that gets called every time there is a change to the underlying data or the DOM initially gets mounted. And before we render any of the HTML content, this function will fire. Now, what we're doing here is we are initializing the Teams SDK, and we're getting the context for the session. And once we get the context, we're setting it to state. Now, the Teams context object contains some basic information like your UPN, your email address, your username, but it doesn't give you anything super rich that is stored in Graph, like, for example, your profile photo. And the objective with this exercise is to go and retrieve your profile photo and display it in your Teams app. Okay, so we've set the state. Next, what we want to do is perform single sign-on authentication. And what we're going to do first is create a request object, and this object will contain two callback methods. One that we will execute if the SSO getAuth token function here succeeds, and one if it fails. And if the getAuth token call succeeds, we're going to execute SSO login success. Okay, so I'm going to hit pause now, and we'll resume with SSO login success after I run this app, because the app is now running, the server is running, and ngrok is running. And also before, actually, I'll get into that later. Let's just run this. Okay, I'm going to open the debugger, hit run. Live coding makes me nervous, but so far so good. Okay, so Edge is now launched, and we can see that Teams is loading. Now we should see the app install dialog appear any second now. Any second now. Okay, I'll have some knock-knock jokes prepared ahead of time next time. Okay, and here we go. That's a good sign that we're getting ready to see the app install dialog. And I'm going to install the app. So as you can see, the app has side-loaded into the Teams web client. And I've already hit the install button. You're not missing much there. But what you're seeing now is the single sign-on speed bump. We're asking the user to consent to performing SSO. And you should only need to do this once. Okay, I've consented. Hit accept. Perfect, we got the SSO token, and now we are going to consent to graph, because this app actually does two things. It performs SSO and then exchanges the SSO token for a graph access token so that this app can retrieve the user profile photo and display it in the Teams app, which is what we're doing. And that's not something you can do without calling graph. So how do we do all this? Now let's go back to the code and see what's going on. Great. And I believe we left off at the SSO login success function. And if you recall, we had to consent twice. Once we had to consent to SSO, and that happens immediately after we perform this get auth token call. And you shouldn't have to do that again until your token expires. And afterwards, we had to consent to graph. And that happens afterwards. So get SSO, SSO login success. What happens after SSO login success? We get the result, which is the token, and we are saving it to state in the SSO token field on this component. And once we've set it, we execute this call called exchange client token for server token. And what this is going to do is it's going to take your SSO token and attempt to exchange it for a graph access token so that you can use that graph access token to make a call to graph and get your user profile photo. As you can see, we are calling this API called get graph access token, and we're passing the SSO token. And this is something you're just calling your own backend server. And it's going to have the same URL as the app is running from. And even though the API server is a separate project that's running in a separate port, we're able to use the exact same URL because in this package.json, we're specifying that localhost 5000 is going to be a proxy server. So that's just a technicality of React apps, and you can look up how that works later if you're interested, but it just works. Now, what we're going to do is check after we call the server. Let's look into what happens. I'm going to open up the server code, server.js, and we're getting the tenant ID from the SSO token that the front end passed to the back end. And this is the access token endpoint to retrieve your graph access token. And I'm going to skip over this part here. This is just the details of querying graph. But what's interesting is here. Now, if you recall, I had to actually consent to graph. And you should only have to do that once. And this code here will show you the next time you access the app, you do not need to consent. And this code here will show you why you need to consent. So we already queried using this fetch call your graph access endpoint. And we got the data object back from that endpoint. Now we're going to check the response happened. Okay, so this line here is checking to see if we received an invalid grant error or an interaction required error back from the graph access point. And this error means either it means you haven't consented to the app, and you need to consent to this app. You need to consent to this app because either your admin hasn't pre-consented to this app, which is very, very common, or your IT admin requires that you perform multi-factor authentication anytime you're accessing this data, which is also a very common use case. So if we catch either of these errors, we're going to send back a 403 with this consent required error message, and the client will handle that. Or if everything's okay for the most part, we're just going to send the graph access token back as the data object. And if there's an unknown error, we're just going to throw a 500. Now let's get back to the client code. Okay, so what you guys saw was we returned a consent required error back, and we're going to handle it. So if we require consent, we're going to set consent required to true, and we're going to show the consent dialog. And when we show the consent dialog, we are just simply calling the authenticate method from the Microsoft Teams SDK, which pops open that default Azure authentication experience that you saw. And if the user consents, the consent success method is fired. And we are going to set the result, which is just your graph access token, into the graph access token field. And then once that's set, and we're going to say that consent has already been provided. Now, since we're making a change to state, that triggers a lifecycle update, and the component did update method is fired. Now we're going to check to see if the previous state did not have a graph access token, but we now do. And if we do, we're going to say call graph from the client. Okay, now we're going to call graph from the client, and we're going to use the graph access token that we saved in state to retrieve our profile photo. And we're going to take the blob data that's returned from that call to graph, convert it to a photo, save it to the photo state object. And during the render method, we're going to return the photo. So that's it in a nutshell. Alan should have the Azure app registration that was created when we did all of this. And by create, provision is the right word to describe what occurred. And we can quickly take a look at what happened under the hood to show that none of this was really any special magic. We're just provisioning an Azure app registration on your behalf. And also, let me show you a couple of things here. So if you'll notice in the env files that are in the server code and your client code, we've pasted all of the information that is relevant to displaying your project into the files. Now, these are the fields that get created that are part of your Azure app registration. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can.
Okay, there we go. Okay, where do you want me to click first?
No, this is perfect. So as you can see, we created this SSO app registration on the back end, and this is powering the Teams app that you just saw. So all of the client IDs are here. If you lose it, the redirect URIs. One thing to note is that at the very beginning, you were asked to provide the domain name where your app's going to be hosted from. The one we used was teamflix.ngrok.io. If you see the application ID URI field in the essential section of this app registration, you can see teamflix.ngrok.io. If you don't have a paid subscription to ngrok, or if you're just changing your domain name a lot, you're going to have to come here and update that field, as well as the redirect URI every single time you update it. So it's good to have a fixed domain name that you don't have to update all the time if you're going to be doing this. Alan, would you mind clicking on API permissions? By default, you'll get user.read. We've already added some here just for fun at another point. But if you would like to request more permissions, what you need to do is come to this page, hit add permissions, hit Microsoft Graph, hit delegated permissions, and you can just select the permissions that you'd like. But if you notice on the right-hand column where it says admin consent required, none of these require admin consent, meaning the end user can consent to the app themselves. However, Alan, would you mind clicking on something? There you go. Admin, unit, read, all. If you were to, for example, request this permission, the end user, a standard user, will not be able to install the Teams app and actually use it. They can install it, but they'll be greeted with a message that says your admin must pre-consent to this app, or your admin must consent to this app. So if you're building apps for the Teams store, you may want to avoid using these permissions unless you have a way to access those admins and ask them to pre-consent to your app. If you're building LOB apps, this should not be a problem because generally admins will be pre-consenting to your app, or you'll know who they are so that they can do that. If you're building 3P apps, generally you want to stick with permissions that don't require admin consent. So for each of these permissions, you can just copy and paste them. And I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now. You can copy and paste those permissions into the env file in the API server project and just separate them with a space. And that's how you request more permissions. And the next time that a user tries to load up your app, they'll be greeted with the consent dialog again, asking to consent to those permissions. And that is this feature in a nutshell. Please look out for the update later this week. Try it out. If you find any bugs, if you hate it, please let us know and we'll fix it. We're not that hard to
if you love it. If you love it, let them know.
That's it. But constructive feedback is definitely more helpful.
For sure. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
One other thing is the bot SSO is coming soon also. Samples for that. I don't know if Karthik, you mentioned that.
I haven't. So this is Tab SSO. Bot SSO is on the horizon, and we're excited to get that out to you as well.